Good morning, Meshach. It's Thursday, July 14th, and today I'm going to try my best to convince you not to purchase a Daily Wire Plus subscription. Right now, thousands of people across the United States and world are considering the media source because internet sensation, Canadian psychologist, and New York Times bestselling author Jordan Peterson just announced his move to the platform, which I found concerning, to say the least. Why? Well, to understand that, we'll have to understand a little bit more about Dr. Peterson, the Daily Wire, and the concerning ideologies that both represent. If you're here because you're a big fan of Dr. Peterson or the Daily Wire, I implore you to leave your biases at the door and hear me out. The Daily Wire and its accompanying hosts present a severe danger to the intellectual foundations of our society, and are committed to a type of reactionary politics which propagates potentially life-threatening misinformation, which sows doubt and fear amongst their followers, and which neglects the needs of the least advantaged members of society. If you are ideologically committed to the ideas that Dr. Peterson shares, or you regularly watch shows with hosts like Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Candace Owens, and Dennis Prager, I'm under no illusions that this video is going to completely revolutionize your views on politics and the world. But if you listen carefully, I hope you'll find me serious enough to start doing some doubting for yourself. And maybe you'll even come to the same conclusion that I have, that the Daily Wire is dangerous. Let's begin with the reason I'm even talking about the Daily Wire in the first place. Jordan Peterson, a well-known Canadian psychologist. Others have recorded Peterson's rise to fame more thoroughly than I have time to do in this video, and I will leave some of those resources in the description down below, but the highly abbreviated version is that after his time in academia and as a clinical psychologist, Peterson decided to dip his toes into the world of politics, where he was warmly received by a group of young men who felt they needed a voice of reason during these crazy times. Peterson's first real claim to fame was after the C-16 bill was passed by the Parliament of Canada. It was a bill which cemented gender identity and gender expression as a prohibited mode of discrimination under Canadian law. Peterson said that the bill would lead to compelled speech via the use of pronouns, and then used that bill as a platform to talk about political correctness and identity politics. His academic speech and polished demeanor, which he toured with the likes of Joe Rogan and on national television, clearly struck a chord with audiences, and soon enough he was getting millions of views on his YouTube channel per video posted. Okay, well maybe I disagree with Dr. Peterson on the minutiae of some Canadian law regarding transgender issues, especially because the law that launched his career doesn't even mention pronouns, let alone compel Canadians to a certain type of speech. But whatever. The reality of the situation is that Jordan Peterson had something to say, and the world was ready to hear it. Of course, he wouldn't have gotten very far if he only had one topic to discuss, so 5 years after his initial rise to fame, what does Jordan Peterson have to offer? Well, to hear him tell it,
they're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
What is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion.
Okay, well, by that description, Jordan Peterson seems like some sort of self-help guru. And that's because, in some ways, he is. His book, 12 Rules for Life, is exactly what it sounds like, and includes rules like stand up straight with your shoulders back, make your bed, treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, and be precise in your speech. I'm not here to tell you that those aren't valuable pieces of advice, or that Peterson is wrong for having said them. In fact, I think those pieces of advice are crucially important for a lot of people. And if his ideas stopped there, I might be a supporter of Peterson's. But his ideas don't stop there. You may have noticed that in addition to claiming he helps people build a solid foundation to help weather the storms of daily life, something he is trained for as a clinical psychologist, he also talks about things like privileges, freedom, and impulsive pleasure. And here is where I believe that Jordan Peterson becomes dangerous. See, Peterson does two types of self-help. One for the self, and one for the society. He believes we face a whole host of issues which are harmful for the well-being of people in Western society. whatever that means, and addresses those issues by espousing what boils down to be a pretty standard conservative view, mixed with a little bit of conspiracy theory and a lot of dramatic flair. Among the issues that Peterson identifies are the rise of postmodernism, Marxism, wokeness, radical leftism, and the mistreatment of men in our society. So let's take this point by point and see what lies beyond the academic veneer of Peterson's ideologies. A little forewarning for this next section. It's going to be a bit dense, but I think it's important to our understanding of Peterson's belief, so bear with me. So if you've listened to any of Peterson's lectures, especially some of the older ones, you've probably heard him talk about these philosophers, who he correctly identifies as postmodern thinkers. The only problem is that he expresses some serious misunderstandings about what they thought and what they represent. According to Peterson, postmodernism is the next step, the next evolution of Marxism. In fact, he's gone so far as to say it's the way that academics hid their communist beliefs inside their work, because by the time they were writing, society had already denied communism. But that can't really be true, because a lot of these philosophers were writing at the height of communism. If it wasn't already a rejected ideology, why didn't they just admit to being communist and openly support the idea that they thought was best for the world? The reality is that postmodernism and Marxism are completely different things, and have different ideologies, which often put them at odds with one another. As Peterson puts it, Marxism describes the fundamental relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and all that postmodernism is a sleight of hand, a changing of the terminology from bourgeoisie and proletariat to oppressor and the oppressed. But again, that's not true. First of all, Marxism describes a very specific relationship between the working class and the upper class. Postmodernism is not concerned with that dynamic at all, and consequently does not endorse the same beliefs about history and progress that Marxism does. But most importantly, postmodernism is characterized by its rejection of grand narratives. You know, like the type of grand narratives that are fundamental to Marxism. Peterson has actually acknowledged this contradiction, and there's a post about it on his website. There are a bunch of problems with this post, including the obvious typo of the word factors, which instead reads factors. Whatever happened to being precise with your language, Dr. Peterson? But the biggest problem is that it doesn't actually address his misconceptions about postmodernism and its relationship to Marxism. So there's a disconnect at the very inception of his socio-political thinking. A Medium article titled "On Peterson's Postmodern Neo-Marxism" responds to this post nicely, and I will leave that along with the rest of my sources in the description down below. But the long and short of it is that postmodernism and Marxism are two distinct areas of philosophical thought. They come from different academic traditions and have different goals. Okay, you might be thinking, but what does that have to do with me? And more importantly, what does that have to do with Jordan Peterson? A slight misconception about some obscure topic of philosophy doesn't mean that he's an alarmist or a dangerous political figure. This isn't dangerous information, so why should I use this as the basis to discredit Peterson writ large? Well, in this case, Peterson's misunderstanding, or possibly deliberate misrepresentation of postmodernism, is actually central. It's the entry point through which Dr. Peterson begins to unload a laundry list of unfounded political ideas. In the very same article I was discussing earlier, Peterson says that fields such as gender studies, social work, literary criticism, anthropology, law, education, and more are all negatively impacted by postmodern thought. So if you're still with me, and you're still a Peterson devotee, consider this. Not only are postmodernism and Marxism connected, so too are the rest of the topics he likes to discuss, like trans issues, woke culture, radical leftism, higher education, the rejection of hierarchies, the mistreatment and ostracization of young men, and dozens of other topics. He's a psychologist, I remind you, not a sociologist, not a philosopher, not an economist, not a political scientist, and certainly not a gender studies expert. Peterson doesn't have an academic background in any of those subjects, and doesn't understand postmodernism, which he sees as connected to all of them. This really weakens his criticisms. And if you go back through his lectures with a critical eye and knowing that he doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about Marxism and postmodernism, it completely changes what you're hearing. In fact, the next time you're listening to a Jordan Peterson lecture or interview or what have you, and he refers to neo-Marxists, think about what he's saying. Are those people actively calling for violent revolution, or are they pointing to overall systemic problems in society and pointing out that power dynamics are important to analyze? Getting the foundations right is really important, because everything coming from that is dependent on that. Peterson doesn't get the first thing right, so he's wrong about the other stuff too. But let's be honest, you're not here because of Peterson's reading on Foucault. You're here because you noticed a problem in society and in our politics and in your daily life, in our academic spheres. You noticed an assault on reason. And you found a guy that's willing to tell it like it is. Or at least you found a guy that sounds a lot like he's doing that. Whether or not it's epistemically connected to postmodernism or Marxism doesn't matter to you. The reality of the situation is that in recent years there seems to have been an attack on reason, and for some, a notable attack on masculinity. And once again, what Peterson has to say about it isn't all wrong. The fact that there are biological differences between men and women is true. The fact that rough play is important for young boys and that you shouldn't raise boys and girls in the same way is true. Young men, including my demographic and a little bit younger, do seem to be more depressed and demoralized recently. So Peterson has some true things to say about this topic. Having these conversations isn't an inherently bad thing. So once again, I return to the question, what makes Jordan Peterson dangerous? Because instead of sticking to true descriptive claims about psychology, his primary academic discipline, he decides to move into the realms of politics, philosophy, and economics, my primary academic disciplines, and frankly, he seems woefully unequipped, or from a more skeptical view, intentionally manipulative. He claims, for instance, that the description of the Western civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy is damaging to both men and women, and that the patriarchy, which is described by modern social scientists, is a fabrication. First of all, I'd like to encourage Dr. Peterson to follow his own advice and be precise with his speech. By beginning the conversation with terms like tyrannical patriarchy, he is framing it poorly, and he is priming participants of the conversation not just to defend the existence of the patriarchy, but the existence of a tyrannical patriarchy, which is a much taller order. Not only does the word tyrannical imply intention, it also comes paired with imagery of fascism and violent brutality. Perhaps oppressive or controlling would be better words for this circumstance. Tyrannical seems intentionally provocative. Whatever the case, it doesn't seem that Peterson is even using the word patriarchy in the same way as most would understand it. As he clarifies in a GQ interview with Helen Lewis, he doesn't think of the patriarchy as a male-dominated society. He thinks of it as something else. But when prompted to share his definition of the patriarchy, instead of sharing his definition of patriarchy, he instead says that men don't actually hold that high a status in Western society, saying that they have higher suicide rates, lower grades, are the victims of more crimes, are more likely to find themselves in prison, etc. But why is he even talking about that? If he doesn't think that patriarchy refers to a male-dominated society, then why is he pointing to the fact that men aren't actually dominant in the society? Whatever the case, just moments later, in a bizarre twist, Peterson is clarifying that he does think that Western society has elements of the patriarchy in it, even though he adds a bunch of caveats and provides it as a possibility more than a reality. He goes on to say that if the patriarchy exists at all, it exists based on competency, not power, which is an odd thing to bring up, because no one brought up competency, or power for that matter. What becomes clear in this interview is that Dr. Peterson thinks that belief in the tyrannical patriarchy is an all-or-nothing belief, and that ambition and competitiveness, masculine characteristics as he sees them, are frowned upon. More than that, he thinks that belief in a patriarchy is fundamentally hostile towards men. But as Helen Lewis rightly points out, it is possible to believe in an overarching system that is the patriarchy while still recognizing marginal improvements for women, and to not devalue the positive attributes that masculinity has. It is possible to believe that men bring valuable traits to the workplace while also believing that feminine traits aren't valued sufficiently in culture writ large. It can indeed be that the patriarchy exists, but Helen Lewis can still be grateful for her position in society and think that women have come a long way since the 1920s, even under the tyrannical patriarchy that Peterson wants to describe. This incongruency in Dr. Peterson's thought becomes even more clear when he speaks about hierarchies as if they are self-evident and justification for men's high status in the workplace. Beyond his academic speech, though, is the assertion that women are less competent than men. less competent at least in negotiating their wages, but really less competent in climbing the hierarchies that are fundamentally masculine and which exist in our workplace. And if that's his belief, I think he just stumbled across his own hypocrisy. If a patriarchy does exist in the West, despite his flimsy protestations, then the reason that the workplace doesn't work for women in the West is because they're designed for men. He thinks that the hierarchies that exist in the modern workplace best suit men. And that's exactly the problem, according to a lot of feminists. Now, he would counter that point by saying there are certain areas of life that are fundamentally masculine and other areas of life that are fundamentally feminine. And so the fact that men are more prone to climbing the corporate ladder, let's say, is just an indication of how men are. But there's lots of evidence to indicate that's not true, and I'll leave those sources in the description down below. No one is saying that male contributions to the workplace aren't valuable. People are saying that female contributions to the workplace aren't sufficiently valued and aren't compensated accordingly. Then consider his belief that the gender pay gap is mostly a lie and can be explained away by the general behaviors of men and women. That's not true. The gender pay gap does exist, and it does exist as a result of discrimination. He will even admit that, but he downplays the role of discrimination in creating the gender pay gap. There are lots of sources recording this reality, and there are even some pointed rebuttals to Peterson's arguments. Once again, I will leave all of that in the description down below. Okay, so you still might be thinking, so what? He's wrong about postmodernism's relationship to Marxism, and he's wrong about your specific definition of the patriarchy, but everyone's entitled to be wrong every once in a while. What gives? Well, to answer that question, I want to take a step back. Instead of focusing on specific topics or areas of study that I think Jordan Peterson misunderstands, I want to take a step back and look at the worldview that his ideas create. I want to take a look at the effects of Jordan Peterson's repeated misconceptions, because they do accumulate. I want to understand Jordan Peterson's worldview. So first things first, Peterson thinks that pretty much everything taught at a liberal arts college is connected in some way or another to Marxism. Everything from critical race theory to gender theory to the economics of inequality, it's all communist at its heart, which presents a red under the bed mentality that scares his viewers away from ever engaging with the areas of study which are helping us understand inequality and how best to address it. Not only is this stance unacademic, it's also woefully simplistic for someone supposedly as educated, well-read, and well-spoken as Peterson. Is there a liberal bias at most universities? Yes. Is political correctness overwhelming earnest conversations all over the English-speaking world? Yes, I think so. But those ideas are completely separate from Peterson's radical idea that postmodernism and Marxism are fundamentally the same thing. But that's not all. Peterson doesn't believe that the patriarchy exists, so is quick to dismiss claims that women are harassed or mistreated in places of work. He is skeptical of woke anti-racism and so downplays the effects that discrimination has on minorities. He doesn't believe that accurate climate models exists and so downplays the effects of climate change. On that point, he's even gone so far as to say that we shouldn't be concerning ourselves with addressing climate change because the climate disaster that we're headed for will allow politicians, probably on the left, to implement whatever policies they want. He believes that gender theory is Marxist, so the pleas of transgender communities for us to accommodate them in our discourse is tyrannical and evil. In short, Peterson's fundamental misconceptions about things like the patriarchy and postmodern philosophy lead him, and by extension his followers, to harmful ideas and bad policy prescriptions. Speaking of climate change as a non-issue or an issue that we shouldn't act on is harmful. Blatantly misrepresenting Canadian law to say that the Canadian government is becoming Orwellian is alarmist and, again, harmful. Okay, well, maybe you don't agree with Peterson on issues of climate change, or gender theory, or economics, or philosophy, or racism, or the value of higher education, or the value of properly representing laws that will be enacted by the federal government. Maybe you're a fan of Peterson because at a low point in your life, you needed someone to set you straight. And Dr. Peterson was the person to do that. Maybe you're a fan of Peterson because he has a no-bullshit attitude about self-help and advocates for radical belief in oneself. Maybe you think that freedom of speech is invaluable and that his defense of it, though improperly motivated, is crucial during these times. Maybe you saw this moment during his 2021 interview with Steve Edginton and recognized the value of his work, even though some of it might be edgy.
I mean, I had some somebody called me this week. He just got my number sort of randomly, and he said, "Who is this?" I said, No, who is this? He told me his name. He said, "Are you Dr. Peterson?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Really?" And I said, "Yes, really." And he just burst into tears, and he just sobbed for 5 minutes uncontrollably, apologizing. And then he said his grandmother had died, and his mother, and that he had become suicidal, and that my lectures, he'd watched a lot of them, and that had helped him, guide him through that. And well, I've seen a lot of that, and that's dangerous. It's dangerous. I'm not unhappy about it. I'm not unhappy about it. It's an honor to be able to help people. Really, it's a privilege. And I'm thrilled that that's what's happening. But by the same token, it's a lot to see. I have to be very careful to see all that and to be able to handle it. And it's very dangerous, because if I make a mistake of any sort, I'm in so much trouble.
If that's you, then you're the hardest part of Peterson's audience to convince. You follow Peterson not because you necessarily agree with him on all the stuff he has to say, but because he's good for you. And I would hate to encourage you to do something that's bad for you, so I won't. Instead, I'll encourage you to look for places online or elsewhere where encouragement and affirmation can be found without someone trying to manipulate you and use your vulnerability as a way to spread their ideologies. I will share some of my favorite content creators that have done that for me, and I encourage viewers to leave some of their favorite Jordan Peterson alternatives in the comments below. I will forewarn you that a lot of my favorite content creators will be left-leaning, and that's because my politics generally fall to the left. And I know that some people are looking to have their ideas both challenged and affirmed by people on the same side of the political spectrum as they are. There are places to do that online for people that fall to the right, and I will try and find some of those places for you guys and put them in the description. If I can't find any, then hopefully you can check out the comment section and find some recommendations there. Otherwise, tread carefully. The internet is a dangerous place, and I encourage you to be really critical of every source that you find. Jordan Peterson describes problems that don't exist, exaggerates problems that do exist, connects ideologies that don't align, and then uses those connections to discourage viewers from the pursuit of knowledge. He does not often misrepresent individual studies, but he does often misrepresent academic consensus on a particular topic, and he has a lot of bad readings of philosophy. But that's only Dr. Peterson. As it happens, he's joining a right-wing news organization that's even more problematic than himself. I don't have the time nor the will to go through every video the Daily Wire has ever released on all its platforms by all its content creators, but in my experience, not only is a lot of their content characterized by falsehoods and misrepresentations, but I'd go so far as to say a majority of it is. Even when making descriptively true claims, the conclusions that they draw from them can be conspiratorial at best and downright manipulative at worst. But like I said, I can't take on a whole news organization in one video. Or at least I won't in this video. So instead of trying to fact check everything the Daily Wire has ever produced, instead I'm going to try and convince you that the Daily Wire is not interested in having earnest conversations, it's not interested in matters of fact, and it's certainly not interested in representing its opposition accurately. To do that, I will use two examples. First, I will analyze Ben Shapiro's recent breakdown of the interaction between Josh Hawley and Khiara Bridges. And secondly, I will discuss how the Daily Wire's acquisition of PragerU indicates that the news organization is more interested in political messaging than the truth. In the most recent episode of The Ben Shapiro Show, the poster child of the Daily Wire reviewed a clip that has gone viral of an abortion hearing, and it is an interaction between Senator Josh Hawley and Khiara Bridges. Here is how he introed that clip.
So Josh Hawley points to the fact that when she is talking about quote-unquote women's rights, what she really means is not women, because she literally believes that men can give birth. And so he says, you keep saying things that people on the left say women's rights. Well, it's not really a women's rights issue if men can give birth. So can men give birth? And she is the astonishing sententiousness of this human being. It's the dripping scorn is incredible. Here we go.
Okay, well, we're not off to a great start. Calling Kiara Bridges sententious and dripping with scorn is not a great way to approach a sensitive subject like this one, especially because, as you'll see in a moment, she definitely wasn't dripping with scorn, but let's continue.
Professor Bridges, you said several times, you've used a phrase, I want to make sure I understand what you mean by it. You've referred to people with a capacity for pregnancy. Would that be women?
Many women, cis women, have the capacity for pregnancy. Many cis women do not have the capacity for pregnancy. There are also trans men who are capable of pregnancy, as well as non-binary people who are capable of pregnancy.
So this isn't really a women's rights issue.
We can recognize that this impacts women while also recognizing that it impacts other groups. Those things are not mutually exclusive, Senator Hawley.
Oh, so your view is that the core of this right then is about what?
So I want to recognize that your line of questioning is transphobic, and it opens up trans people to violence by not recognizing them.
Wow, you're saying that I'm opening up people to violence by asking whether or not women are the folks who can have pregnancies?
So I want to note that 1 out of 5 transgender persons have attempted suicide. So I think it's important
because of my line of questioning? So we can't talk about it?
Because denying that trans people exist and pretending not to know that they exist
I'm
is
denying that trans people exist by asking you if you're talking about women having pregnancies?
Do you believe that men can get pregnant?
No, I don't think women can get
So
pregnant.
you are denying that trans people exist?
And that leads to violence? Is this how you run your classroom? Are students allowed to question you?
Absolutely.
Or are they also treated like this, where
No,
they're
they're
told
allowed
that they're
to question.
opening up people to violence?
We have a good
by
time in my
questioning?
class. You should join.
Oh, I bet.
You might learn a lot.
Wow, I would learn a lot. I've learned a lot
I
just in this
know,
exchange.
absolutely.
Extraordinary.
Now, before we touch on Shapiro's analysis of this clip, let's do our own. It should be clear to everyone watching this video that Senator Hawley and Dr. Bridges are speaking past each other in this clip. Senator Hawley is talking about sex. He's talking about people with penises, and is trying to portray Bridges as absolutely crazy for ever imagining that men could bear children. But Bridges is saying that the term man refers to trans men, and that by refusing to acknowledge that, Senator Hawley is being transphobic. Now, I'm not here to convince you of any trans issues. I'll leave that for another time. I'm here to convince you that Shapiro is deliberately misrepresenting his opposition. So let's keep watching.
What an obnoxious, terrible human being. My goodness. And that's because she's never had to answer a difficult question, ever. She's filled with intersectional criteria, and she spouts intersectional woke nonsense. And that means that nobody's ever asked her a question. She's never had a PhD advisor who's forced her to answer a question. She's never had a student who's asked her a tough question that she hasn't been able to dismiss with the wide eyes and the rolling eyes and the gestures of disdain. She's never had to answer that sort of stuff because, again, it's an oligarchy. And oligarchy means you quash dissent.
There you have it. That is Ben Shapiro's analysis of that interaction. So let's run through and see what he actually had to say. I wrote his points down to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting him. Point 1. Kiara Bridges is an obnoxious, terrible human who has never had to answer a tough question in her life. That sounds to me a lot like an ad hominem attack that has nothing to do with the content of her argument, so let's ignore that and keep going. Point 2. Dr. Bridges has never had a PhD advisor or student ask her a tough question. Okay, well again, I don't feel like that really addresses her point. And the academic institutions she attended were accredited by the same organizations that accredited yours, Ben Shapiro. So we're getting more flavors of distrust with higher education, but still no content. So let's keep going. Finally, we get to point 3. She has never had to answer any questions because it's an oligarchy. I'm sorry, what? What is an oligarchy, Ben? Are you talking about the senator who is sitting on high and dismissing the constituents that he's supposed to represent? Who is only there because women were recently stripped of the right to choose what to do with their body? I mean, yeah, I guess you could call him an oligarch. I would probably stay away from calling our system of government an oligarchy, but you wouldn't. You would think it's crazy that 9 people who weren't even democratically elected could turn what was one day a right into a felony the next day. That would be crazy. That would be almost the definition of an oligarchy, right, Ben? I mean, certainly you mean that the senator is representing an oligarchy. You couldn't possibly be referring to the woman who is sitting and pleading with her representative to acknowledge the existence of a group of individuals. Could you?
This is the sort of stuff that people face in the classroom. And it bleeds down. Her line is complete garbage, by the way. It is just sheer bullcrap. When she says Josh Howley, do you believe that trans people exist? Trans people exist in the sense that there are people who believe they are members of the opposite sex. This does not mean that their claim is accurate. Okay, schizophrenic people exist. This does not mean that the radio is talking to them. Trans people exist in the same way that anorexic people exist. There are people who believe that they are fat when they're actually underweight. This does not mean that they are actually fat. So you're not denying anybody's existence. You're denying that their claim about reality is true.
Okay, Ben, but isn't transgenderism rooted in the idea that one's belief about oneself is true? If you stripped a transgender person of their belief of self, then they would cease to be a transgender person. So by denying that a transgender individual's beliefs about themselves are true, you are essentially denying their existence as a transgender person. You'd be calling them mentally ill or deranged or delusional. Of course, you would say that, because you're deliberately misrepresenting the opposition and their stances to get your audience to act.
But she suggests, of course, that this means that people are committing suicide. And this is always the threat that the left likes to bring, and it starts in academia, it bleeds all the way down. The idea is that if you make an argument based in fact that you're going to cause somebody else to commit suicide. Now, in American law, and in law typically, the idea that you can cause someone else to commit suicide is pretty dicey territory generally. And you actually have some pretty specific evidence saying that somebody is telling somebody to commit suicide in order to even attempt to hold them accountable for their commission of suicide, because there's an intervening actor, namely the person who's committing the suicide. The generalized point the left tries to make is that if you say that a man is a man and a woman is a woman, a bunch of people who believe they are members of the opposite sex will be so despondent about the fact that biological reality exists and that you are saying it. Not even that it exists, that you're saying it, that they're going to go commit suicide. There's only one problem with this line of argument. It's complete nonsense.
But Ben, certainly you see that in this line of reasoning, you're begging the question. The whole topic of discussion is whether or not trans men are real men. Whether or not the term man refers to trans men. No one is saying that trans men don't have female sex organs or female chromosomes. But as you know, and as you've stated before on your show, gender and sex are different things. So your claims about the corruption of higher education and the like are irrelevant. You're right. Of course that's nonsense, Ben, because that's how you choose to represent the other side. Of course a man is a man and a woman is a woman. That is logically impossible to refute. If M equals M, then M equals M. If F equals F, then F equals F. But the question is about what a man is, and what a woman is. The worst part is that you know this. You must. It is impossible for someone to have spent as many hours, as many days thinking and speaking about transgender issues as you have, and not know this line of thinking. To not understand this simple but fundamental problem behind all transgender issues. The purpose of this video is not to convince you that transgender men are real men. The purpose of this video is to convince you that Ben Shapiro is not engaging with his intellectual opposition in good faith. And I think if you listen to what he says and how he's saying it, that will become self-evident. If you don't trust me, the next time you're watching Ben Shapiro, instead of taking his word on what the opposition thinks, stop, write down what he says they think, and then go research it for yourself. It may take a while, but 10 times out of 10 you'll find that Shapiro dramatically misrepresents what the other side thinks. As always, videos about Ben Shapiro, the way that he speaks, videos debunking his, etc. are all going to be in the description down below. So again, please check it out. Finally, let's talk about the Daily Wire's acquisition of PragerU. Look, I was trying to be pretty respectful of Jordan Peterson, and I went pretty easy on Ben Shapiro, but PragerU is nothing short of propaganda. It calls itself an academic resource while unabashedly misrepresenting quotes, data, and entire fields of academic studies and the lot. In this video, I'm not even going to bother debunking any of PragerU's videos because it is so unanimously agreed upon that PragerU is sharing blatant falsehoods that you can find a playlist of over 254 videos debunking PragerU content in the description of this video. And many of those videos were released before the Daily Wire's acquisition of PragerU, which means that the Daily Wire saw this propagandist organization and decided, you know what, yeah, that fits our brand, let's acquire that. They decided that's the audience that they want to share their news with, and they were happy to invite Dennis Prager onto the team, even though he and his organization have been caught in countless lies and contradictions. If that doesn't scream intellectually dishonest, then I don't know what does. Again, please click on that playlist in the description. A lot of those videos are super interesting, and you can learn a lot about the topics being discussed from people who actually know what they're talking about. Some of those videos are pretty long and boring, but if you're a fan of Peterson's, then you shouldn't mind that. Look, I could go on for hours about how Peterson and the Daily Wire have been negligent about how their ideas have spread in radical right-wing online groups. I could debunk hours of Daily Wire content. I could combat them on a philosophical level and explain why their ethical systems are self-contradictory. But at the end of the day, I can't make you think anything. Nor would I want to. But I hope that this video has shown you that the Daily Wire and Dr. Peterson are dangerous. They are not legitimate news sources, they do not seriously engage with the topics they claim to, and they are not worth your money. Of course, I don't just want to tell you that all your favorite academics and show hosts are wrong and then leave. So in addition to a bunch of resources, I will also be leaving a bunch of my favorite content creators in the description of this video who discuss a lot of the same topics that Peterson and Shapiro do, but in a much more sober and informed way. If you made it this far into the video, thank you for sticking around. I know this was a long video, and I bet it felt especially long if I was telling you things you didn't want to hear the whole time. I will admit that this content is a little bit different than the content that we usually do here on Sam and Meshach, but nevertheless, I think you'd enjoy sticking around. So if you enjoyed this video, consider clicking subscribe. And don't forget to hit the notification bell if you want to stay up to date with the content that we post on this channel. If you liked this video, or you think that it should be shared with a wider audience, don't forget to hit the like button. It really supports small channels like ours. And leave a comment telling me what you think about Jordan Peterson joining the Daily Wire. I'm going to be doing my best to answer all questions, comments, and concerns in the comment section, so get to writing. Schmackers, I love you guys. And Meshach, I love you too. We disagree about Jordan Peterson, but I think that's alright. I hope this video at least provided a different perspective on how one can think about the Daily Wire and Jordan Peterson. With that being said, don't forget to treat yourself like someone you're responsible for helping, and Meshach, I'll see you on Monday. Peace out, nerds.